I have Dan McGrath on with the Minnesota majority. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and basically we're going to talk about election integrity here.
This isn't normally our focus. Minnesota Majority is not a voter rights group.
Oh, you aren't?
No, it is not. It's something we stumbled into by accident. Let me give you a little background on it.
Yeah, give me some background.
Get into the press conference. Because it's kind of interesting. We actually were just using the Secretary of State's voter file list to do phone calls, surveys, and mailings.
Now anybody can go get the
Sure, it's $46, and it's got everybody's voter history on there. You can see if they're a consistent voter, if they vote in primaries. There's pretty useful information there for political types.
So just for your own personal research for the organization?
For our general everyday purposes of informing voters on what legislators are up to, just for contacting voters, we were using the list.
Okay.
And as we were going through it for several months over last summer, we started to notice some weird anomalies in there, some things that we couldn't explain, like, well, why are there two of this same person registered to vote? And it appeared that they were the same individual with two separate voter registrations. And we found a very high number of voters that appeared to be still actively voting even though they were over 108 years of age. Now, Minnesota's a pretty healthy state. People can live a long life for certain, but there were a lot. I don't remember the exact number right now.
There were people on there that were over 108 years old that were registered to vote.
And and still voting.
And still voting.
So this kind of dove us into the entire investigation. We started analyzing. We took the whole file apart piece by piece, looked at it from every angle, and we found some pretty interesting things, which leads us to the press conference, is just the latest discovery of a massive discrepancy in the number of votes reported on election night and certified by the canvassing board and the number of voters that are accounted for having cast those ballots on the Secretary of State's file. And the Secretary of State has admitted to the discrepancy. He came out almost immediately after our press conference and said, oh yeah, the difference is about 40,000 voters. So there's 40,000 ballots that have been cast with no corresponding vote histories on the file to indicate that they were legitimately cast. And the Secretary of State has audaciously stated that his goal is to get that number down to 1,000. So there's only a difference of 1,000. Now, there's a requirement that this balance.
Well, and how soon is it supposed to balance?
Well, it's supposed to balance 6 weeks after the election.
Okay. Now, what I understood federal law is immediately.
HAVA says immediately. Statute in the state of Minnesota is more specific, and it provides 6 weeks for the county auditors to get all these records updated and squared away.
Now, define the canvassing report again. The canvassing report shows what?
Well, the canvassing board basically certifies the numbers from election night.
How many people voted that day?
Yeah.
Okay.
They tell you how many people voted, but you don't know at that point who voted.
Right.
And it's the updates to the statewide registration system that tell us now who voted. And the number of who voted has to add up to the number of votes.
Before you filed your lawsuit, there really wasn't any attempt to tell anybody about these discrepancies.
No, and I'm not even sure that they knew about it, because I was informed by Secretary Ritchie's legal counsel that the process was done, and they had a complete SVRS history file, and then they gave me the discs.
All right, we're going to see Representative Emmer now, hear what he has to say on this discrepancy.
The problem, we'll give an example, in a township election, if it's done by mail ballot, how do we know if we don't have a correct list that everybody who was registered and entitled to vote actually got the opportunity? It's even more imperative now because right around the corner in August we'll have primaries for city and school board type elections. We've got to make sure that this list gets corrected. The Secretary of State proposed reforms, so-called reforms, during the last session. This was the position that we took in the House. You got to get this right first. You got to make sure that you have accurate, verified voter registration lists. It's clear that that's not happening. Before we go any farther, we're going to keep having problems in this state if we don't address this and address it now.
Emmer brings up the aspect. There's already been elections done where the with townships or whatever ever other group that's had to vote or had to cast votes, their voting records weren't accurate.
Right, and that's especially significant for the townships that do mail-in voting, because the ballots are mailed out based on the voter registrations that are on the file.
So some people wouldn't get a ballot.
Well, yeah.
Okay, that's pretty bad. It just shows the necessity of why you have to have this done in 6 weeks.
It's just one of many reasons why it's so important to have this information accurate and timely.
All right. Well, something else came up that I heard, and I think you had a press conference. I couldn't make it to that one, but 2,800 dead voters?
Yeah, we employed a mail house company to do what they call a death suppression on the voter list.
I mean, what's involved in that?
They check the name of the individual, the address. They try to compare your birth and determine whether the person that was reported as dead through their many sources is the same person that lives at that address or lived at that address.
Okay, and so you come back with, okay, these 2,800 people at these addresses that are on the voter registration list have died.
That they had voted in 2008.
They voted in 2008.
And had died sometime before then.
Okay.
I've got a stack here of additional records that we've pulled up. These are all people that have died, and we have been able to pull up a online death record for the person. So a death certificate exists for these individuals. And these all voted in 2008. So we've only actually taken a close look at a handful of all of these and tried to determine how the voter history records reflect a vote for these people when they died before the election.
The Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, just ruled that one state who has voter ID, you have to show identification. They ruled that that's constitutional.
Indiana?
It was in Indiana. Okay, so that would be something to help prevent this type of activity.
That's, I think, the only thing that would prevent it. I mean, there's things that they could do if they tightened up our rolls and made sure that dead voters weren't on there, for example, and felons were properly challenged, and all these steps that are actually prescribed in law. If they were taken and the system was run like a tight ship, it would prevent some of this. Mm-hmm. But the ultimate is photo ID. Mm-hmm. It's a lot harder to walk in and say, I'm John Johnson, if my driver's license says I'm Dan McGrath.
I can go in, I'm not from the precinct, and I can just write down any address. Can I? And how do they check it?
Well, there's a couple ways. When you initially register to vote, you do have to provide some sort of identification. Whether it's a utility bill that shows that you live in the precinct or a driver's license or something. There's a certain level of requirements there, unless you don't happen to have any of that. Then we've got this wonderful system called the voucher,
right,
where you can get somebody else in your precinct to say, I know that guy, he's okay, he can vote.
And he lives at this address that he's saying he does.
Yeah, which is a gaping hole in the integrity of our election system, especially when one person can vouch for up to 15 people.
Okay, well, are people giving false addresses?
It would appear that way. Using the same sort of service that we used to initially determine potential dead voters, we also did a match on address verification, which is another thing that mail houses do. If you're sending out bulk mail, you don't want to send to addresses that don't exist. Let's see, this is before 2008 elections. 100,000 of the voters on file as having voted in 04-06 elections had addresses that didn't exist. So
100,000?
Yeah. Now that was the list from this mail house.
Right.
So we had to go and verify some of this on our own. We drove around and we took pictures of vacant lots and swamps and freeway overpasses and parks and warehouses. There was no residential property at the address that was listed for these people.
Felons voting.
Yeah, potentially thousands. We've identified hundreds.
Well, and then you get back to the same issue then again of how do you prove that this was the person that voted? How do we know that somebody else didn't sign for them?
Before the election, Channel 9 discovered felons that were on the rolls. And they approached the Secretary of State with, I think it was right about 100 felons that they discovered that were on the voter rolls. They're not supposed to be. They're supposed to be marked challenged felon. And some of the people had registered to vote while they were incarcerated. While they were in prison, they were registered to vote. So this is a fraudulent voter registration. Someone borrowed their name.
Okay. Dan, thanks for being on the show. Be live next Thursday night at 8 p.m. Thanks for watching, and God bless all of you.